right. So welcome everybody to our today's Geneva Macro Labs online talk. I am Marianne Schörling, Head of Stakeholder Engagement at the Geneva Macro Labs, and I will moderate our session today together with Tala Dowlatshahi, who is Senior Independent Advisor and a member of our advisory board at the Geneva Macro Labs. Thank you, Tala, for being with us today and tuning in from New York, if I'm not mistaken. Great that you are with us. We are very pleased also to welcome today two leaders, both distinguished speakers, who will talk with us about how foresight methods and models to build trust actually can help us for getting ready for our future. We are having with us Sharath Srinivasan, professor and co-director at the University of Cambridge and co-founder of social business startups such as Katikati. And we also have the pleasure to discuss today with Kat Tully, founder of the School of International Futures and former advisor in UK's Prime Minister's Strategy Uni. Thank you both for being with us. Before I introduce you in more detail, I would like to briefly present the Geneva Macro Labs and our online talks series. So a warm welcome for the participants who just joined us now. Who are the Geneva Macro Labs? We are a think and do tank based in Geneva and are an international team. Our mission is to leverage the institutional, financial, and human capital around us. In a nutshell, we give our best to walk the talk, and we work in the space of sustainable development. We co-develop solutions and publish respective papers. We address policy measures and started a discussion paper series. We host conversations in form of events, conferences, afterward gatherings like today, and workshops. And we just launched Geneva Impact, which is our latest initiative where we create a fast track for smart and actionable impact projects together with our growing community of leading minds and our innovation partner, Geneva Macro. Geneva Macro is a development fund of the Micro Group that supports pioneering projects, tackling the challenges of social change. So we're really happy to have them on board as well. And together we develop projects on how to use innovation, technology, how to use impact design in such a way that our future becomes more sustainable for all. Next week, we kickstart 3 expert groups that work on specific impact concepts in the realm of environment and nature. And I would warmly welcome you to reach out to us if you would like to learn more about Geneva Impact, our latest initiative, and if you would like to join even our endeavors. So please consult our website, which I will as well put into the chat in a second, and we take it from there. So today's session is part of our online talk series, our webinar series, where we cover topics that allow for conversations across countries, sectors, and professions with the aim to accelerate progress towards a sustainable future. And we focus on sustainable development in practice. We focus on future of work, democracy, economic outlooks, COVID-19, and how technology such as AI or blockchain could help. And as a result of the webinars, we want you to really be able to connect with the community, to jumpstart together new initiatives, and to join our Walking the Talk. So let's have a look at our agenda. Just put up the slide here. So when we think about foresight methods, trust modeling, trust building, we are ultimately trying to find some answers on how we can build our future in a world where facts are contested and global fragilities and social fractions continue to be exposed. So the question is, what kind of a future do we want and how we can move to a common agreement on these questions? And in order to better understand the power of foresight methods, to identify the right questions that we need to ask when we are about to invest in technologies, to forecast the future and to benefit from lessons learned for trust building, we are having Sharath and Kat with us today. So Sharath Srinivasan, thank you that you are with us today. You are the CEO and co-founder of Katikati, alongside your fellow technologist Luke George, and your work as professor at the University of Cambridge, where you co-direct the Center of Governance and Human Rights, but also your engagement as fellow of King's College inspired you to create Katikati as a social business startup and communication analytics platform. It's really a great example, and I'm sure we will hear more about it today. Few words about it. Katikati enables organizations to build transformative one-to-one conversations with people who matter to them at scale. And Sharath, you are a true expert when it comes to trust building models and their application, as well measuring impact, because you also co-founded the Africa Voices Foundation, a citizen engagement nonprofit. You served there as executive director for 5 years until early 2020, and you understand well how to practically use research for good. So we're really looking forward to your insight. I would also like to welcome again Kat Tully. Kat, looking at your vita that you shared with us, you have an extensive experience as a practitioner and thought leader, helping governments, civil society and businesses to be more strategic, more effective, and better prepared for the future. You are also the founder and managing director of the School of International Futures. We've learned that you consult, teach, and advise on emerging strategies and strategic foresight internationally. And previously, you served as strategy project director at the UK FCO and policy advisor in the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit. So we are also very keen to learn from you about your work and how to explore the fundamentals for strategic foresight. So as usual, both speakers, you will have 10 minutes to share with us your insight. And afterwards, we will have our Q&A session for about 25, 30 minutes. So you can post the questions as usual in the Zoom chat box and comment during the presentations. And the Q&A will be led by Tala. So Tala, we're looking also forward to that session. Okay, well, Sharath, let's start with you. So trust is not an everlasting resource. We learned that during the pandemic now. It's something that we need to look after, especially in the tech world. We need leaders like you, actually, who understand how positively use communicative power for building trust in fragile ecosystems. So could you share with us which lessons can we learn from what you share today when it comes to building trust in fragile systems?
Well, thank you, Marianne. I'm just going to share my screen, and I trust you can all see my screen now. It's a great pleasure to be with you, and I want to thank Marianne and Tala and Eckhart, Renata for the invitation to be here, Tala in particular, and I'm really excited about it, partly because the initiative I've been working on for the last year, we're still not fully fledged. This is one of the first times I get to talk about Katikati, and I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about what we're trying to do here, what the spirit of it is, and some lessons that I think we're already starting to draw from it around thinking about trust. The context is a tough one. It's COVID-19, as we all know, and it's also in East Africa, in Kenya and Somalia. So I'm really speaking about the work with Katikati, but Katikati has been supporting this other organization, Africa's Voices Foundation, that I've been closely associated with for many years in its COVID-19 response in the region. And Africa's Voices, it's itself a spin-out from research that I was leading with colleagues at the Center of Governance and Human Rights at the University of Cambridge. So it's a story of taking the academic hat off and putting the practitioner hat on, and the fact that that's not necessarily a one-way direction, that actually doing work in the applied work in the real world is a really rich source of insight and learning that can come back to the research environment. And it's that, that loop that has always interested me in my work. So I'll start by just giving you a bit of a sense of where this is coming from in recent thinking around COVID-19. So a recent study by researchers at Columbia, Harvard and Cornell analyzed 23 different countries and really emphasized that from their study that trust is really important for compliance with health advice. Nothing that's too extraordinary there. But Sheila Jasanoff, a professor at Harvard, explained this, that really close scientific knowledge helped by experts is the thing that is needed to be communicated more broadly to people who would benefit from having such knowledge. But how do you build such closeness? That's one of the real challenges in a infodemic kind of era with hyper communications, etc. And her emphasis was that it's not unidirectional or one-way communication, but rather bidirectional and multi-directional communication that matters and which helps to build trust. And so you can think of a lot of the ways that we interact with the people who matter to us and to our interventions in the world. And often we're asking them survey questions and reducing them to a set of boxes, or we're getting them to interact with robots that are trying to be as human as they possibly can, but failing often. Or we're broadcasting out messages in large ways and sort of inundating the population with messaging. We might be also sending bulk messages, which people receive, and they know that it's a bulk message they're receiving. So one of the things we've been interested in is, well, what kinds of communications really make sense in these contexts? And the work that I've been doing with others for some years now has really been motivated by that kind of challenge. And there's two aspects that I want to talk to today. The first is about leveraging existing media and communication spaces that are already trusted by citizens as a means to create dialogue and discussion. That's the work of Africa's Voices. And the second is actually trying to be able to build scalable one-to-one personal communications that can enhance trust. And that's the work of Katikati. So with this in mind, I now want to take you all the way to an actual voice, someone who in May 2020, so early May last year, still early days of the pandemic, this is a message that we received from someone in Somalia. So if you imagine that you're a displaced person on the outskirts of Mogadishu, and this talk of COVID-19 enters into an existing reality of insecurity, precariousness, seasonal risks of cholera, of cyclical droughts, of a locust plague that's now creating havoc. You don't see a global once-in-a-lifetime health crisis. You see risk and trouble amongst existing risk and trouble. And this affects how you interpret the information you receive, who you trust, and how you act. And I think what I would emphasize is that people have very sophisticated worldviews that will shape the success or failure of what is an emergency health intervention. And this person here is saying, look, coronavirus is a signifier. It signifies crisis and risk and threat. Poor people have been living with coronavirus all their lifetimes, but it's only when it affects rich people that suddenly everyone's talking about it. That's the sort of expression of an open communication that we got when we created a trusted space, when someone felt like expressing what they think about this coronavirus. And they asked at the end, between coronavirus and hunger, which is worse? And this is a real challenge in fragile contexts because of the way that lockdowns, etc., have produced effects on populations. But to get to the point that someone could be communicating like this, and this is a text message that we received from them, what kind of space of communication can lead to an honest expression like that? Well, that's what Africa's Voices has all been about. It's an organization that now, 5 years after it was founded from our research, is based in Kenya. It's led by a colleague, Samuel Kimeyu, who's doing this work from outside of from the continent, and they're working in primarily Kenya and Somalia so far, using approaches that amplify the voices of citizens towards the decision makers who affect policy, social policy, and economic policy, etc. So they're all about giving a voice and making it heard. And for quite some time, this methodology has come up with a few key lessons that I would share with you here. One of the things that's been interesting about creating trusted communication spaces for creating discussions that actually transform people's lives was to focus on media and technologies in use. So one of the earliest things we found is that for the vast majority of the population in sub-Saharan African countries, really working on this kind of work to amplify citizen voices meant going to very simple technologies, local language radio, unlike sort of fetishizing the latest applications, etc. The second was that a commitment to two-way engagement, but the dialogue has to be created rather than one-way extraction of data or just messaging out one way. So the importance of public dialogue, active listening is crucial to the effectiveness of any type of communications of this nature. The third was to always keep valuing human voices and unlock multiplying effects through individuals' voices that you value. And too often when we prioritize quantitative scale, we tend to abstract away and minimize the unique richness of individual voices. But we found that that need not be the case. If you want to build a trusted communication space, you really emphasize recognition of individual voices. The fourth piece was about the way that we realized that most of the reasons why our interpersonal communications don't scale is because we find it very hard to deal with open communications with large numbers of people. So we then reduce communications to surveys, to closed communications that people can't fully express themselves. But what happens if we accept the burden of interpretation and we decide that we must come up with the mixed methodologies to understand people expressing themselves in their own language and more freely with open text? Can we actually take on that burden and design really smart technology around that problem? And for that, we found that it was really effective to design collaboratively from the ground up rather than from sort of textbook designs as such. And this has been a story of deep interdisciplinarity with technologists and social scientists. So from there, I want to just quickly say what we did in the context of COVID-19. This is a long-standing research where we realized that this kind of approach of using interactive radio to reach hard-to-reach populations would be really valuable in health crises. And we were already doing lots of research with Africa's Voices on this basis, and recently published an evaluation of the method in the Journal of Mixed Methods as a way of tackling one of the key challenges in health crises, which is rapid and continuous social insight and communications in trusted spaces. So when COVID-19 hit, what we did is we designed a methodology around interactive radio that involved using public service announcements to broadcast to the large amounts of the population with key messaging that had been tailored with health experts, allowing listeners to send in their SMS to a free short code that was expressing their views, that was then going to be subsequently addressed in a radio show with a health expert. But along the way, we were able to analyze this open text data and understand what kind of key themes are coming up. Do analysis on this and feed that into public health responders. So that was the core design. But what we realized is that often when people are answering questions that we ask on radio shows, they're answering the question with a question, or they're answering a question with an urgent concern. So it would not be good enough just to do this without actually being able to respond individually to people, and that would be crucial to maintain their trust. So that's where we introduced this new capability called Katikati, which is this new space of handling one-to-one messages that are coming in over SMS. But humans are triaging those messages, identifying urgent issues, identifying questions, and responding, also using text message. And if we could do that at scale, but with minimum numbers of people by designing the technology very well, then this would be a way of sustaining one-to-one conversations with the people who were engaging. And that's where this new innovation came in. And so over the course of last year until late last year, we'd handled quite a large number of these conversations and provided advice to over 10,000 people in Kenya and Somalia, and handled urgent cases that neared towards 800. That was the work of Africa's Voices and Katikati in the COVID response. But to give you a sense of what this looked like, we developed a sort of a platform that is a bit like a WhatsApp platform in a sense. It's for text messages, and it's these are all a list of conversations with anonymized IDs on the left here, and that particular conversation is the selected conversation here. And someone's asking, how can I prevent myself from getting COVID-19? And what we're able to do is tag that data. And then use a set of standard messages that were peer reviewed, a response protocol, that then the handler could just send the message in English or Somali or Swahili, depending on the language. And what we're trying to do is create a technical solution that was human-led rather than machine or automated, but still had efficiencies built into it and could produce analysis of the outcomes. So that was Katikati, and we've built a lot of functionality all around this to enable organizations to communicate one-to-one with large numbers of people and configure these conversations in particular ways, as well as comprehend and analyze them. And one example of where this is really important in terms of building trust was that when Africa's Voices asked a large number of Somalis what their views on COVID-19 were, about 12% expressed content that was concerning in terms of being rumors or negative stigma or misinformation towards coronavirus. And some of that was quite challenging content. Now, the issue here is, how do you then start to engage one-to-one and build a trusted communications channel that you can then impart important information? So one of the things we could do with Katikati was set up a kind of A/B test. So this is an experiment where the standard group A, got the peer-reviewed response protocol. So they got the right messaging, but it was just communicated in a very standard way, following the response protocol. But then the B group, we created a more active engagement approach. We used active listening techniques and more tailored communication engagement, but the content was still the same. They were still getting this core content from the peer-approved response protocol. So these conversational enhancements were used for Group B over Group A, and Katikati allowed us to do this. And this just gives an example of how that looked. Conversation in which the person expresses their views, and then the B group was asked active. They were greeted. They were asked if we could talk to them further. Asked about whether their friends and families thought the same things, and a conversation begins. Whereas for the A group, they got the standard response protocol, and the B group after that got again the standard response protocol, but again with content delivery and active listening that was tailored to a more attentive listening approach to the conversation. From there, what we found was that the B group compared to the A group was more responsive conversationally, and they kept engaging over the subsequent weeks more actively. And finally, the content of their engagement, rather than just being greetings or just chatty messages, was also more substantive. So quite simply, an active listening tailored approach, which was not just treating people as the object of bulk messages or standard messages, but was creating interactions that were personal, was building a lot more engagement. And that would be the basis to then impart content that is going to be more likely to be trusted. So while we weren't testing trust to the full extreme, we were testing what enables building a more active and engaged conversation that is more likely to be trusted. And interestingly, this was a much more substantial result for engaging with women than men in the context. The samples sizes were about 100 each, so it was a pilot study, but women were far more responsive to the active listening conversational enhancements than men, which was quite exciting about the ability to then incorporate this kind of capability into the strategies of communication of the Africa's Voices team afterwards. So hopefully from here, you've got a bit of a sense of what I've been up to recently and why we're very excited about this approach with Katikati, this idea of convening and configuring individual conversations with many thousands of people, but still conversing personally, and yet comprehending all of this at scale so that you can iterate and learn and build more trusted and effective communications between organizations and the people that matter to them. I will end it there. Thank you, Marianne.
Thank you, Sharath, for your thoughts. It's very enlightening how you used a conversational engagement to build up trust with the community. So thank you for that. In particular, you showcased why we should actually invest in mixed methodologies rather than just using one and not complementing it with other techniques. So I'm now moving directly to over to you, Kat. You are coming from a strategic point of view when you talk about how to use Foresight models for strategic action. And so we would like to learn from you today, what are the fundamentals that we should actually look at when we are talking about using Foresight methods for better understanding the future ahead of us. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Marianne. And let me just say how Sharath, speaking together, I think you'll see that our work is actually very complementary, and I'd love to talk a little bit more about this point about human-centered collective intelligence gathering enabled by technology that is true to the conversational aspect is, I think, a very, very interesting question to explore. But let me first of all say a huge thanks to Geneva Labs for introducing me. I actually worked briefly in a time in Geneva, and the intersection of the different motivations, passions, professions, sectors that come together in Geneva to create a vision for the future, for a better world around the SDGs. It's a very fertile place indeed. And in fact, it was working in Geneva and then afterwards in various governments, and that I realized we came to the conclusion behind what we do at the School of International Futures, which is that there's no lack of insight about the future. It's not a supply side issue. What there is there's a demand side problem. It's like, how do you use it to make effective decisions today, and in particular to enable effective change. And so what I'm going to talk about today is exploring the fact that in this COVID world where we're talking about building back better and facing uncertainty, we can still make strategic planning decisions using strategic foresight, and that they are absolutely based on outcomes, emergent, collaborative and active listening approaches, in particular to the periphery. That's where the signals of change, emerging change, comes from. However, what's particularly interesting is that whereas in my work in the past, it would be very much technology as a driver of change itself, we are now looking at technology as being a focus of futures work, looking at different dystopian and utopian scenarios of futures, in particular because of problems that are emerging around algorithms and bias that need to be brought to the fore. And so I'm then going to end up, after talking a little bit about strategic foresight and technology futures, to really talk about an approach to address that, which is to listen to young people's voices about what future governance systems for AI, but other emerging technology might look like. So that's a little bit the arc of my intervention. So in terms of the fundamentals of foresight are essentially looking at drivers of future change, of which technologies are very often one of many. But in fact, looking at how they are interdependent, how, for example, especially from a sustainable development goal perspective, you might be interested in maternal health, but actually, if that's your outcome, then you need to look at infrastructure around hospitals rather than necessarily the number of doctors. And then you use that to identify alternative futures, not just scenarios that you desire, developed collaboratively with your citizens, but also scenarios that you might need to be prepared for. And I think it's important when we're thinking about technology that we realize that, you know, who would have thought 100 years ago that Alexander Fleming finding penicillin, that 100 years later, that you'd still have 2 million children a year dying from easily preventable diseases. So when we're projecting into the future, we always overestimate the power of technology for good and underestimate its interdependencies around issues to do with power and access and control. And it's that we try to explore in some of our work. So when this is a world model that we kind of use, very often, of course, you have standard demographic drivers of change, some of them predictable, that often have values-driven attitudes associated. We've been doing a piece of work on the future of higher education and talking to lecturers about the fact that in 2030, you will have Generation Alpha, people born from 2011 onwards. They are very, very different to Generation Z, let alone millennials, and actually beginning to understand the implications of that is very important. The fact that Africa will have, by UN projections, half of the world's population in 2100, all of the interdependencies of how climate change impacts, forcing, you know, migrations from rural areas to urban areas may intersect, for example, with a post-carbon economy. So perhaps with rents in certain countries, and therefore the governance changes that will happen in certain countries, changing how those intersect are really interesting. There's uncertainties and you play them out. And very often technology is a driver of those stories that you're telling about the future. However, what's interesting about the moment that we're in now is that technology itself has had an official future in terms of 11 big players on the West Coast saying this is how technology can help support the world and the future of the world. And that official future is being challenged. The questions around algorithmic bias, the questions around the new colonization of data out of Africa, all those questions basically mean that we need to think about what actually is happening and what are the actual costs associated with the current model. And tech is vulnerable at the moment because as a set of interlocking businesses, there are external costs for others that are now becoming visible. And I guess the interesting point that we have is that when you're looking at, for example, what the appropriate response is, whether it's GDPR in Europe, how you govern emerging technology, when governments, businesses think about their future, international organizations think about what the implications are for the work that they're on, they need to kind of think about, well, you know, what's going to happen and what should we do about it? And I guess the point that I want to make is that young people's voices are critical in having processes systematically thinking about the future using strategic foresight techniques to come up with those visions, those alternative scenarios and the actions. So what we have here is, and amongst those young voices, it's fantastic incorporating the kind of outreach that Sharath has been talking about. And actually we design processes where those kind of insights can come in. But in particular, spearheading the design of those processes with what we see as being a cohort of very important change makers, which are Global South foresight practitioners. Okay, so here you'll see that on the back, for example, on the right-hand side, on the back of the COVID crisis, we brought a series of them together to reimagine what a post-COVID future could look like, positive future could look like. And in particular now, what we're running is a project across the African continent where we're looking at what does an effective data governance system look like that is not a kind of colonial imposition of GDPR in different individual countries, nor is it the equivalent of Microsoft going out and saying what the appropriate regulatory structure is, but actually working with different people to actually identify the approaches, the policy solutions, the risks and the opportunities, and embedding that into the community. So what we're finding is that there are a set of early adopters across the business community in the West Coast of the US, amongst international organizations and fantastic actors across the continent, including incubators, VCs. But as Sharath says, the point of multi-dimensional and multi-stakeholder connections is really important, but bringing people together to kind of think about what is the appropriate response for responding to emerging technology, and the governance infrastructure is very important. And all the insights that Sharath gave remain very, very relevant. And I'd add another one, which is that because we're having effective collective trust building exercises over time, but we're looking forward into the future, let's say 20 years. We have a saying in our field, which is that for however long you look forward, you always need to look back, which means that, and you need to look back twice as far. So, and the narratives of history, especially colonial legacy, are incredibly important in these kind of conversations around governance. So I will probably not say much about this, apart from saying that just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the kind of people that are shaping their future using these structured techniques. We're kind of tool agnostic, but we're very much about working with these young foresight practitioners. For example, Namatai, a 21-year-old in Zimbabwe who is bringing futures literacy and championing constitutional reform in Zimbabwe. It's about really understanding how to kind of wrest, if you like, the official future from incumbents and bring her community of 21,000 activists across Zimbabwe to have the space to, with confidence, talk about what an alternative future looks like, and to do that in a way that's safe and effective. And I think you see a lot of these same kind of intergenerational fairness considerations play out in a lot of countries across the continent at the moment, whether it's Nigeria and Uganda. And then always, you know, the legitimacy of young people to talk about the 2050 horizon is very powerful. It's like it's theirs. And so the question then is then how to kind of connect that back into incumbents and enable them to listen. So that is effectively the work that we do. I think I'll stop there, but if you're interested in any of the material and more information, please do look at the page link, because there's a whole series of things that you can download. But I'll just leave you with one final thought, which is that in a world where representative democracies are and leadership is really struggling, an ability of a community to collaboratively imagine their futures is an act of profound political empowerment. So something that I'll leave you with, and very important, I think, over the next 5 to 10 years as we navigate an extremely turbulent decade over the next few years. So thank you very much, Marianne, and interested in questions.
Thank you, Kat. I see we are a little bit over time, but I think you both made some very important points that we can now discuss in our community. Thank you for making a case around true inclusion, which really means that we need to think about those voices that have not been heard in the past. Thank you, Kat, for that. I would like to highlight to our audiences as well that you published a couple of blog entries on foresight, strategic foresight on our website, and I would love to share that link with the audience, because I think it will be of great help, interest to you all. So please consult the chat of our Zoom box. And I would like now to hand over to Tala to guide us through the Q&A session. We have about 20 minutes left. We will do the wrap up at the end very quickly, so that we have now about 22 minutes to discuss a little bit more the topic. Over to you, Tala.
Thank you so much, Marianne, and thank you so much to Kat and Sharath for those powerful presentations. We work in similar fields, communications and strategy. And in my work recently, I just participated in a lab yesterday. So I have a follow-up question. Our community is entrepreneurs, private sector, businesses, and there is all this talk of fairness, inclusion, diversity, these trainings that are taking place at the corporate level. And I wanted to get your insight in terms of what are your thoughts on this? Is this actually just for show? Is this process actually more inclusive? If a private sector is working in Uganda, is it including members of the local community in its work? So I guess, Kat, if you could answer that first, and then Sharath, if you'd be so kind to answer the question.
I mean, it feels as if the kind of work that I do and the people that we work with in private organizations, you know, this may have been corporate social responsibility, let's say 5 to 10 years ago. Now it's actually part of the strategy and planning function for the future of the organization, I think. But there are early adopters and there are foot draggers. So there are early adopters on boards that understand that the role of the board is an intergenerational stewardship. Okay. There is also people who understand that as their program, you know, the kind of who they see as being their community is wider than just their stakeholders or immediate buyers and clients, and others who don't. But what I am seeing is that that as a generational shift, as more and more millennials get into positions of power, that is going to change. And I think the values are very clearly different. So this is the direction of travel, is genuine, authentic openness And secondly, I do think that, you know, the waves of problems that are going to face us over the next over the 2020s, when it comes to ecological challenges, health challenges, societal challenges, are going to make it clear to even the foot draggers that this stuff needs to be taken if the company wants to survive. I think that now that the issue is that as take the kind of the hydrocarbon industry, yeah? As the hydrocarbon industry realizes that it needs to exit, the people who are left at the end, right at the bottom, they become a lot more difficult to deal with. So those dynamics are going to be there, but I think the general trend is positive.
Yeah, Tala, I mean, I think very crude continuum on which to place these sorts of this new energy around this would be, you know, the worst probably instrumental, because it's about a political economy that is now, you know, funding new initiatives of this nature, and that happens across every industry. And you saw that humanitarian sector leave no one behind, accountability to affected populations. It's a knee-jerk reaction because funding moves in that way. I think less cynical is a risk management strategy, because actually it's smart to do that. A little bit more positive is an enlightened self-interest perspective, which is that in the long run, I actually need to be doing this because as an organization, it really matters to our success. And then right at the end is a sort of values-driven response, which is a serious sort of like commitment, because this is the world that we should be living in. And I think you see an array of different responses along that line. I think what worries me is that time and again, the real risk here is treating an agenda like this as a means to an end is very dangerous, right? Because people, like the quote of that person in Somalia who I put up, and the displaced person on the outskirts of Bandir. People are very sophisticated and very well attuned, you know, antenna for what is real and what's phony. And if you open up a space for inclusion and discussion, but it's a fad and you aren't really listening, it will come back and bite you. And we were talking about this earlier with Eckhart and, you know, Google and, you know, researchers who are looking at race and technology. But if the organization is not really listening, you know, people aren't going to stand for that. And so once you open up a conversation space, and it speaks to another comment that was in the chat, I think that the thing is that it's easier to send out closed answer surveys in English to people and just see what answers you get back. It's harder to open a conversational interaction and be on the other end and ready to respond and take that seriously. It's a deep commitment. So, you know, I think this is a dangerous space to be. You have to move with confidence and commitment in order to do it properly, and otherwise it can really backfire.
Well, thank you to both for that. I wanted to turn to Eckhart. I know you had a question, and also Renata, and then I see Michelle had a follow-up, one of the first, so I just turned in that direction.
Yeah, thank you, Tala, and thanks to both speakers. I mean, excellent discussion tonight, as usual. One question basically to both speakers is a bit more kind of concrete in terms of the practice of communication. So what I take from both your intervention is that it's actually much more important to how do you talk to people rather than doing anything, you know, like in terms of intervention in the local arena, if you want. And one example that came to my mind also when I was listening to you, Sharath, is that when you think about areas of this planet like Somaliland, where basically the country or the region was totally cut off any official development aid because of its statute, they still managed to develop, and they still managed to kind of do something out of their limited resources that they had actually quite successfully. The question that becomes is, how do you talk in this kind? I mean, is it just communication, or is it the way we communicate, or what do we actually have to do in order to build the trust with these people? And I think that both goes to both speakers basically. I mean, understanding a bit better the type of engagement that we want to have with these communities in order to improve their livelihoods. I think I would like to have your reflection on this. Thank you.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, I think that. You know, that again, I go back to the quote.
Yeah, and maybe I can go next.
Oh, sorry, I heard a voice. You know, the quote I shared. I mean, what strikes me is that a health intervener goes in with a health hat on and a health technical expertise and says, "I'm doing a health program and there's a health crisis." But someone on the other side is living a world and a complex set of influences on their lives. And there's a lot of other reasons to be worried about things, not just this thing that's going on as a global pandemic, which hasn't yet arrived on your shores. And I think the point there is, I think what Kat and I were emphasizing in terms of that conversational approach, having conversations, listening attentively and actively. It's about the fact that if you don't meet people halfway or more than halfway in their world, you're not going to begin on a very sort of solid basis of them engaging with you actively and thoughtfully. So I think that kind of treating people as a means to an end is the dangerous thing here. It sort of quite quickly, I think, is liable to backfire. And I think in the Somaliland context, what does that mean? It means that people are not victims or Christ. They're not people living in a fragile or failed state. They don't wake up in the morning saying, "Oh, I'm living in a failed state." They're thinking about how to make this community and family and society move in the right direction, whatever the history of the Westphalian state system. So you need to sort of meet them on their terms and understand where they're going and what they're about and respect that. And I think going to Michelle's point without jumping ahead, you're right. You don't build trust, you gain trust, and you can trust and distrust are dynamic. They don't just move in a linear direction. And one thing we noticed, for example, with the open conversation technique is we also got more pushback. And I didn't get to talk about this in detail, because the more you open up a conversation, the more you will also open up people to express themselves, which is, no, actually, I don't agree with you. I still think that this is a disease of infidels and, blah, blah, blah. And so, but that's the price you pay. You don't get to just to quickly accelerate them through a linear logic, step by step to the answer you want. It's a to and fro, and you're absolutely right, Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, we have a saying, it's like better not to do any work than to do it badly, because what you're doing is you leave a legacy of a negative legacy behind you. And boy, in our work, do people call bullshit really quickly. So it needs to be really clear what the levers of power and what the kind of things are up for in terms of being redistributed, and being clear about that is really, really important. But I wanted to kind of pick up on your point about, Sharath, about people don't wake up and go, here, oh, I'm in a fragile, affected state. And I think what I find most exciting and inspiring about the work that we do is that this isn't about developed versus developing countries. This is actually about the endeavor of how people come together to do the business of politics and self-govern. And so it's actually equally relevant to conversations in the US, where they need to kind of think about, like, peace and reconciliation processes now, and actually who have got huge spaces where, absolutely it's worse than a lot of developing countries in terms of the standard of living. And also in the UK and also in the EU, and actually being able to kind of bring people together in that endeavor, I think is very, very powerful. And I'll just share with you very quickly another case study, just some work that we've done here, which is, how to be, don't be a bad ancestor, how to be a good ancestor. So this is very much kind of picking up on some of the kind of Greta schools, climate strikes. And it's about how do you create a national strategy for the next generations? And it is very much about harnessing the fact that, we always point to developing countries and developing countries, cities, saying, what are your SDG plans? And actually that process of imagining the future and having a stake in it authentically and genuinely is really important. And some parts of governments, we can learn across different governments, because whether it's Spain, whether it's Germany, whether it's Singapore, whether it's Malaysia, Rwanda are doing some really interesting innovation in that space. But secondly, what does authentic letting go of power, like, politicians need to model what that looks like and how to signal that, because otherwise it's going to be a very painful kind of political discourse in many countries over the next few years.
Thank you. Renata, you had some follow-up questions?
Yeah, I would let first the floor to Michela, because you have a question, then I would go after Michela.
Thank you very much, and congratulations to both speakers for the presentation. Part of my question has been already answered regarding the trust, whether it is something, let's say, building or something static or more dynamic relationship that should be gained instead of built. And I fully agree, of course, I'm happy of this. So I can take this opportunity to put another similar question. I believe trust is very fragile, very strong but very fragile relationship, and therefore could be relatively easily damaged or broken. What do you suggest in order to restore trust? So first, if it is possible to restore trust when someone feels distrusted, and what you recommend to do it. In my opinion, my experience, personal behavior such as consistencies are very much important to keep trust, to gain trust, but also to restore trust. What are your thoughts on that? Thank you very much.
Yeah, and Michaela, first, sorry for getting your name wrong previously, but thank you. I suspect that you actually have got a lot to teach us and me about this, because in a sense, we've been learning what a capability of communicating openly and conversively with large groups of people, what that can enable, that we want to unlock. So and that's a range of uses that this can be useful for. So at the moment, we're going to do some work in Malawi with the Red Cross Society there. They have like thousands and thousands of volunteers across the country, but because of COVID-19, increasingly out of contact and out of reach. And yet it's a huge resource, right? It's a huge capability of not just needing to communicate to send information out to them, but actually to learn what they're thinking, what their intelligence and understanding of their communities is telling a central office, etc. And so I think we're about sort of deploying these capabilities. But what I think in the back of my mind, what I'm thinking is, you can open this up too far and too quickly, and if you're not ready to be on the other end and to interact effectively, and in your behaviors, like you say, show that you're responsive and attentive, and that you don't take too long to reply, then you end up, people switch off, and then you've really lost that channel of connection. So I think I probably have, as I said, more to learn from you than you have from me on what to look out for there. But that's on my mind all the time, is that this open communication channel, and this, you're increasing your responsibility once you do that. Once you decide to engage with another person or with the world, you take on a burden, and you have to be really demonstrate that you accept that responsibility. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I leave the floor quickly to Maurizio before I ask my questions, because that might be already answered.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Very, very fast. Thank you for the presentations. Kat, I wanted to ask you, I saw the map about the next generation future alert activists around the world, and it drew my attention that the numbers in South America are very low. I wanted to ask you, in your experience, what would be a possible reason for that? That's it. Thank you very much.
So there's a couple of excellent Foresight programs in Mexico, actually. And certainly CEPAL, or ECLAC, the UN regional body, does some fantastic work bringing the different ministries of planning across the region together to kind of collaboratively think about the future together. So interestingly enough, this is not because of a lack of interesting insight and foresight. Some might be because actually there may be a historical legacy issue. I certainly know in Argentina that the foresight and long-term thinkers were actually co-opted by the military junta. And so, and this is the danger of like, whose future are you talking about? The official future, the future can, and this is about trust. It can be a kind of a story that people say it's, this is the only future that's possible, which is how it's actually certainly used in some governments around the world. When you think about plans 2030 and all of the things associated with it. So This is why the value of openness and collaboration is critical in Foresight endeavours. So I think that that's possibly a little bit of a reason, not to mention, I think Foresight, so in Latin America, there was a bit of a prospective. It was the French kind of influence and school from Gaston Berger that did it. But anyway, going down into rabbit holes, but certainly very imaginative futures endeavours going on in Latin America, and look forward to connecting to people more. And yourself.
Thank you.
Renata, I know you have a question, but I also see one here from Tibor to Sharath, if you wanted to ask your question, Tibor.
Yeah, ask it verbally. I don't, sorry, do you want to answer already?
Yeah, I read it. So well, thank you, Tibor. So you're asking indeed what the sort of applications of Katikati might be.
Yeah.
And I mean, we're just setting out, and it's interesting. We're setting it up as a social business, and so it's still a very much an early startup. And what we thought about was that and it sort of speaks to Kat's point a bit as well. There are lots of organizations of different types that are able to unlock value that is beneficial to their members or their constituents or their clients or their customers, and thus to themselves. And it doesn't, I don't think having a social orientation should not mean that it's not commercial organizations we work with. And increasingly those organizations provide vital services and vital, goods. So if they're actually better in contact with, the better understanding the people that they're trying to serve, then that is a good thing. I think there's obviously red lines for us as a social business of who we might want to be engaging with this kind of capability. What interests us is also, to be honest, there's a secret sort of agenda here, which is that I work very closely with Luke Church, my co-founder, is a designer of programming languages, a computer scientist in Cambridge. And one thing that's interested us is how you can embed types of politics into technical artifacts and design them to be to make organizations and individuals do things differently. I mean, that's what happens with social media all the time. But what we're looking at is, without explicitly talking about accountability, how can we build logics of accountability in the way that these organizations relate to their constituents, such that they feel more compelled to be responsive and to listen? And so that agenda is as good to be in a service organization that might be commercial as it is. It could be an electricity company doing, serving its customers, as it is in a social change organization. So I think we think the agenda is quite broad, and also it's built not around, it's SMS that we're using at the moment, but the idea is it's sort of channel neutral, because it's the capability to interact that and analyze that and understand that we're focused on. But love to talk about that more if you're interested, but eager to get advice.
I know, Renata, did you have a follow-up question? And then I think we have to close.
Yeah, I hand over to Marianne.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you for your comprehension. So before we are closing, actually, I would like to ask both speakers to kind of highlight their final statement in a few words. I know this is a challenge, but we had really a great discussion that will definitely continue with you. If you would like to share one sentence with the audience that seems very important to you. Sharath, you want to go first?
I was hoping that Kat would go first. I was trying to find my...
Okay, Kat.
Is that gentlemanly in that situation? I'm not sure.
I just suspected that you were very ready.
Yeah, well, I'll just say what I said before, which is that the power of a community coming together to collectively imagine their own future, especially in the world and the uncertain world that we're in, is an act of profound political empowerment.
Thank you, Kat.
I kind of wish that was my sentence, and I think Kat and I need to talk more after this. So I guess my point is we really need to rebuild trust in our digital age, which has not helped trust in recent years. And I think this starts with strategies for engaging with people rather than extracting from them. And from there begins a journey towards gaining trust.
Thank you. That is fantastic, and that will actually, I think, will lead our discussion that we will be continuing. So thank you all for participating tonight. A warm welcome. Thank you to all the participants as well. our time is over for today. It's 7 p.m. here in Geneva. We are more than happy to continue our talk with you. Please connect and share your thoughts via the channels that we will list on the slide, but I can also put that into the Zoom chat box. Please share with us your feedback and your thoughts, and we will be back with you next week with an impact talk on the topic tapping into the impact opportunity, how investors and entrepreneurs actually can co-create value together. Registrations will be open by tonight. We will also share the link with you on social media, and please take a note as well of the link that Renata just has shared on registering for becoming a member at the Geneva Macro Labs. And that's about it. So I wish you an excellent rest of the day, no matter what time zone you are right now tuning in from. And we are really looking forward to reconnecting with you very soon. So, à bientôt. Thank you and stay well.